Hola amigos! Welcome back to part 3 of this little series of videos that I am doing up at Blackstar HQ with Paul Stevens here. This is episode 3. We're going to talk about valves. Valves or tubes for our American brethren. And when they make a difference and perhaps when they may not make such a great deal of difference. So let's first of all talk about some names that people might be familiar with when we talk about, should we start with power amp tubes first?
Yeah, I suppose being a Brit, the first one I should mention is EL34.
Yes.
Its smaller companion EL84, which obviously is known for certain sounds. And then the kind of, I wouldn't say American equivalents, but ones that are used similarly in other big amps would be the 6L6 and 6V6, again kind of a big and a small version. There are many others, KT88s, KT66, KT90, EL36, EL this and that, blah, 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 blah. There's so many throughout history, but those are the ones that are mostly used within our industry that are still currently available.
Yeah, because of course valves would have been used to produce all kinds of audio and visual and not even radar-y and military, all sorts of devices.
All of it for the first kind of 50 years of electronics. Any active device basically was
had a valve
harmonic type of thing, yeah.
But those half a dozen or so different valves that you mentioned were the ones that have been typically used in an audio application.
Well,
or even more specific.
They are still being used now, but the main reasons why those are still being used now is because they were the popular valve choices in audio at the birth of what we call rock and roll and rock and pop and all that kind of thing. So basically, they were the popular valves to use in audio from about 1954 onwards. They weren't picked necessarily because of their sound at the time. They were picked because that was what they had.
Right.
That was the way the amplifiers were made, and that's the sound we have grown up with.
So those are typical power amp tubes, and there always seems to me like there are lots of variants of power amp tubes, whereas the preamp tube, with one or two exceptions, is everybody always just uses the same, whether it's a, whatever.
Well, there are some variations there as well. Obviously, the most common one, what we refer to here, is the ECT83, which Americans would call 12AX7.
But that is first misconception, preconception. That's the same thing, right?
Pretty much. Yeah. I mean, you're going to get differences in valves, whether it is made in China or made in Russia or made in Slovakia or wherever. They're basically the only places that make them now. So there will be slight differences. There are differences within batches, but as far as specifications go, they are supposed to be, you can transfer one to another.
Yeah. Okay, and so within the preamp thing, from my perspective, I'm only really familiar with seeing the 12AX7 become either an AT7 or an AU7, which are minor sort of...
Yeah, basically the ECC83, which is the 12AX7, is the higher gain and lower current capability valve, which is used throughout most guitar amplifiers that have got them in for preamp functions. Then the 12AT7 is a slightly higher current and less gain, so that's used often as a driver stage for phase splitters, things like that, and for reverbs as well. And then the AU7 is lower gain again, but higher current. So what you lose in gain, you gain in current.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that's why you have to have different versions. But as generally, the industry is moving away from valve buffered driven whatever reverb sections. So we're seeing less of them, and also, like particularly in our amps, we're not so much using valves for phase splitters either. So generally just see ECC83s more. So
ECC83s. What's the famous early Vox AC15 EF?
Oh yeah, the EF86.
EF86.
Yeah, and we actually do use that in one of our earlier designs as well. That's actually, whereas ECC83 is a triode, which has certain characteristics. The EF86 is a pentode, which is normally associated with power valves, but it was more developed for communications, radios and things like that. It was a bit of a weird choice that they decided to put that in an amplifier.
I'm sure I've heard that as being perhaps one of the more unstable valves for audio use, and therefore that's why it perhaps hasn't been as popular as...
Yeah, it could be said for that, yeah.
Right. Okay, so there's the picture. Lots of different valves. And I think there is a preconception, misconception maybe, that the reason things like Fenders sound like Fenders and the reason Marshalls sound like Marshalls is valve choice.
Yeah, it's just the valve. Yeah, that's all you have to change.
But what's
No.
the... Yeah,
No.
I mean, and I guess to a certain extent what we've done here is have two amplifiers, same amplifier, one with EL34s and one with 6L6s.
Yeah.
Set up identically to kind of try and demonstrate what happens when you change them. But from an engineer's perspective, what is the point of using a different power amp tube?
Well, again, originally it all came down to what was available in that market at the time. I mean, the 6L6 was popularising guitar amps basically by Fender, and that was what was available in their American market. And then when I suppose Vox actually before Marshall, when they came out, the EL84 was a popular choice here, and it was because it was used in other things. It wasn't used as in, we need a valve for a guitar amp, let's design this. No, these were used in radios and in TVs and all sorts of other devices that needed to produce sound. Probably guitar amps were the last thing they ever thought of, and certainly distorting them. It's just that was what was available. So then when Jim Marshall started copying the Fender design, which they weren't then making at that point, they turned to a valve source that was available locally, which was the EL34.
I love all the guitar stories about when you read any history books of of Leo Fender, and you go, all the woods were used because they were just available, easy to get, affordable, and fit for purpose. And I guess what you're saying is that so many valve choices at Vox and Marshall and Fender would primarily have been just ease of use and fit for purpose.
Valves,
ease of
just
availability.
using valves themselves as the amplifying device, that was because it was all that was available. But obviously that defined the sound. In the same way, and I've long felt this, that people often say now, why do we still use valves? And there is a certain authenticity in the same way that Stradivarius is a famous violin maker from 300 years ago, and his violins still now sell for like millions, and top orchestras they have their lead violinists and many others still playing them. And you think, well, why? Yeah, they're worth a lot of money, and surely we can make better violins now. I mean, sure, yeah, we could make perceivably a better violin, but that makes that sound. And a valve makes that sound that we grew up on. The sounds were defined in the 50s, 60s and 70s largely, and then maybe souped up a bit more in the 80s. But it's using the technology of that day. So it wasn't used at that point to get a certain sound. It was used because that's what was available.
Well, okay, so we're going to take two of the most famous valves, EL34 and 6L6, and just show you kind of what these sound like.
Yeah, because we often get questions from users who say, I want to get more of a Fender sound. Will I get that if I put 6L6s in? Or vice versa. And it's like, well, there's so many other factors, particularly in a modern amplifier where so much of the sounds actually come from the preamp.
Let's just do that. And we will, in a second, go on to show you perhaps a more simplistic amplifier. And how perhaps then the characteristic of that power tube does affect things more. So anyway, I don't even know which one is which here, but here we go.
Go to a clean channel just so we hear a different version.
Right. God, it was more perceptible on the gain channel, I think.
Yeah.
Do it again.
Basically, there is small differences, but it's not as huge as people expect. From going,
it doesn't go
to Marshall sound.
From a Fender to a Marshall sound.
So there's most of that is built into the preamps.
Into the preamp,
and that's what shapes the sound more than anything else. There is a measurable difference when you look at it on the bench, but also the actual amp transformer and everything else has to be optimised for a certain
Can
valve.
we go back to the gain channel? Because I thought it was, and then we might as well tell people which is in which. Maybe I'll guess, just for fun. So here we go. And just to change it. So I think that one is the EL34. I think that's a bit more barky. Just go to the back again. Oh, I don't know, I've confused myself now. Yeah, I'm going to say that one now is the 6L.
Let me just check.
So I think that's the 6L6 one and that's the EL34 one, is my guess. So am I wrong?
Even I've got the
6L6 34.
Yeah, it's
yes.
right. Yeah,
So
well
I think if you tune into this idea that the EL34 has a little bit more barky in the mid-range and the 6L6 is a little bit more bassy and smoother, but the characteristics probably are changing 3 or 4%
compared
of the
rest.
tone. You know, it's really not like light and day. Should we do the same thing?
Yeah.
The same thing on two amplifiers where they are sort of much more simplistic
These
preamp designs.
amplifiers where the more of the tone is being generated from the power valve.
Okay, so let's just switch over to that. Now, right, so now for this part of the demo, we've taken two of these Blackstar Artisan 10 AEs. These again have different valves in the power section. I believe one has an EL34 and one has a 606.
Yeah.
But these are much more simplistic than the amps we were using before. They just have literally a volume, a tone and a master section, and we've gunned them. So these are full volume, and hopefully we'll find that the different power amp has a little bit more impact on the flavour.
I've already forgotten which is which now as well.
Never mind, we'll find out.
One thing to point out as well, because these are actually single-ended Class A as well, which makes
I'm going to ask you
very
about
different.
Class A and Class AB in a minute. They're both still running into the 4x12 though, so you're hearing... You're not hearing the speakers in these, you're hearing this.
We were too lazy to move the mics.
Back again. Now, I'm going to say, although I can hear a difference between the two, I wouldn't have said it's that much more perceptible than it was on the other amplifiers. And B, I'm now struggling to pick out that characteristic that I was able to sort of pick out on the other ones. So I'm not even going to guess which is which.
One is a little bit sparkly, but I mean, I'm going to have to unscrew the back to even check.
Right.
Because I was in a rush to do it, so I didn't.
Well, I think we should. I think we should reveal which is which. So we now know that we have an EL34 in this one and a 6L6 in this one. So let's just go to this one. So if we get the green light on there and we know, right, so this is EL34. This is freaking me out because it's really not, this is probably highlighting all of my misconceptions because it doesn't sound how I thought it might. So here we go, EL34. 6L6. I'm going to literally just play and stomp on them. If you stomp both at the same time with your foot, it'll ready. Here we go. So this is EL34 starting with. So there we go. Valves don't matter. That's what we've just proved.
Oh, it's subtle. It's very subtle.
Okay, look. Let's just do a quick. If I name a valve and you instantly go this kind of sound, you know, for like, or you know, so EL34.
Well, people think Marshall sound, but more mid-rangey.
More mid-rangey bridge. EL84.
Oh, then definitely mid-rangey, sweet sounding, crunchy.
6L6.
Supposedly high headroom, but it depends what amp it goes in, and people associate that with the Fender clean sound, but as we've proven, that isn't always the case.
6V6.
More like a kind of American version of EL84, so nice fat mid-range, crunchy.
KT88.
Then you're talking about a different beast. That's like that you can get twice the volume out of, or twice the power out of KT88. Sorry, did you say it's 88 or 66?
88.
88, yeah. That's why they're used in bass amps often,
Right.
because you can get like 200 watts out of 4 of them.
Wow.
So real high headroom.
This was that sort of change. The original valve amplifiers would only have one valve in the power section, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
And this is where we get this Class A, Class AB kind of terminology.
With a single power valve, it can only be Class A, and known as single-ended Class A. It can only because there's only one valve, and that was as much as people thought power levels needed to be to produce the sound of electric
So you're
guitar.
talking about AC15, I guess, is a famous single-ended Class A.
No,
No?
an AC15 is push-pull.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
no, we think more like a Fender Champ. Original
Right,
Fender
okay.
Champ is 6V6. Some used 6L6s at different stages. But yeah, this is one of the misconceptions about what Class A is and single-ended is.
Right.
Because true Class A needs to be single-ended. But we often refer to the Vox AC15 and AC30 as being Class A, and it is different to the Class AB that we have in bigger Marshall and Fender amps, because it is cathode bias. Again, we've got another version. So you've got the class, you've got whether it's push-pull or single-ended, and then you've got the type of biasing, whether it's grid biased, which is known as fixed bias, or cathode bias, which is just a resistor.
in essence,
and they're all subtly different.
Yeah, in essence, you're talking about. Okay, well, we'll try and, without getting too deep into the science, we'll try and just do the sort of the layman's basic differences. I mean, I know the cathode one. It's fixed bias is where the amp is designed. It wants a certain sort of voltage or level to go through the valve to get the optimum performance, and you manually adjust that. And then on a cathode bias, there's a component in that kind of
basically
adjusts it for you.
Yeah, and a resistor and a capacitor that set it.
Yeah. So you're if you like, there's the cathode biased amplifier is perhaps simpler to just stick another valve in and get it to go. But
with
but
those
it's
you
lower
can.
power and lower headroom.
Yeah.
But I don't really. I've probably had the whole Class A, Class AB explained to me about 100 times and never really understood it. And even the push-pull variant on Class A, this is new. So in layman's terms,
with Class A, the device, the power device is conducting fairly high current at all times, regardless of where you are on the signal, or even if there's no signal, it's always conducting. Whereas Class B and then Class A, Class AB, which is obviously a combination of the two, is where you're only turning on one set of valves, either the one that does the pushing out the speaker and the one that does the pulling back the speaker. That's why it's called push-pull. And with true Class B, then only one of each pair of valves is on at a time. But if you run a musical instrument amplifier like that, then it will sound nasty, because the point where the signal crosses over the 0-volt line, which is known as the crossover point, you get distortion, because the one of the valves will not be quite on when the other one is off, and you get what's called crossover distortion. This is very common in transistor amplifiers as well. So that's why you have this mechanism, the bias, which you adjust so that you bias the valves on just even a small amount at all times. But it means that they run much more efficiently and can produce more power without overheating. That's why, for a given pair of EL34s, you'd normally assume in Class A that they could do 30 watts, fairly clean, whereas they could do 50 watts and a bit and more possibly in Class AB. So it's all about producing more power, and therefore more volume to drive the speakers, which goes back to part 2 or 3 of our discussion. Anyway, so that's where the classes come in. But there's because usually an original Class A amp was single-ended and it was cathode bias, then people assume that cathode bias must always mean this and push-pull must always mean that. But there's 3 different main topologies with valve power amps, and you can have a mix of any of them 3. So it's wrong to assume that just if something is push-pull or that it isn't.
Is there I think in this whole thing we're realising there's no better or worse. Funnily enough, I do remember a time when the marketing departments of all amp manufacturers kind of did this whole Class A. It's like it's better. A bit like for a while on pedals, you had true bypass. It's better. And obviously, I think now we know that it's just horses for courses. But again, in real layman's terms, could you sort of correlate a type of technology to a type of guitar sound that someone might want to get? So if you said, Class A, what is that typically going to do?
Well, again, it'd have to be a combination of all them factors. But I mean, a Class A single-ended cathode bias, so the purest of the simplest of all, which you'd associate with like a Fender Champ or whatever. I suppose an authentic early blues sound, really, where because of the nature of it being single-ended and the fact that when a valve distorts, it distorts differently on the positive half cycle, which is the top of the wave, it distorts differently on the bottom half cycle, and because of that it's naturally producing even order harmonics. Now when you do an analysis of even order versus odd order, then you see that they are mathematically more in tune with the original musical signal. So
I've suddenly realised here that we're now getting into chapter 76 of the Radio Designer's Handbook. That was a little deeper than the layman's term I was hoping we were going to get. But I'm going to stop you at the kind of old bluesy kind of amplifier.
Okay, so moving on to the other extreme. Class AB, grid bias type of thing. That would be, because that's, again, I'm going to have to get a little bit technical, but because that's producing a lot more of odd order, it's more of an abrasive sound, which is great for rock and metal in particular. So those would be the 2 extremes, a kind of a pure, less distorted, smoother signal, or a more aggressive sounding signal with a Class AB amplifier.
Okay, so for people that are going, this whole valve thing's quite interesting, I quite fancy experimenting, what are some sort of do's and don'ts with regards to if you own a valve amplifier that you can quite simply change, in either the preamp or the power amp section?
Okay, in the preamp section it's not too much of a problem, but never put an ECC 83 in the position of an ECC 81 or an 82. So that means never put a 12AX7 where you'd have an AT7 or a U7. As I mentioned earlier, they are higher current devices, so normally the resistors around that part of the circuit will be smaller in value, and that kind of thing will allow too much current through that.
But you can do it the other way around.
You can do it the other way around.
You can put a lower gain
in
a 12AX7
and it'll produce less
a different
gain.
sound. I think there's a good example of that is the on the Fender Hot Rod Deluxe, they do a George Benson sort of signature version, and it's simply got like either a 1287 or a 12AU7 in place of where you'd have the AX7.
Yeah, that's fine.
So okay, so you can do that, and no biasing needed on preamp valves?
With preamp valves, they're all self-biasing with the componentry that's already in the circuit, so not too much of a worry there. Now come on to power valves. A common thing, as we mentioned earlier, people thinking 606s Fender, EL34, Marshall, whatever. The big problem difference between those is the 6L6 runs on much lower heater current than an EL34, which is a problem if the transformer can't deliver that current, and you can end up basically destroying the most expensive part of the amplifier, which is the mains transformer. Now we always design our amplifiers so that basically we use the specification of the higher current, so of an EL34. So if people want to go the other way, they always can. But an original Fender, and possibly even more modern Fenders that are generally running on a 6L6, don't put an EL34 in there unless you want to blow up your mains transformer and see what that smells like.
So is there EL34s and 6L6s I know are the same pin combination. So they'll
nearly.
Are they
again,
not? Okay.
yeah, they are nearly, and that's another thing. Yeah, thank you for reminding me. There is they're slightly different valves because they're not actually both pentodes,
right?
And they have slightly less pins on a 6L6 that are actually used, and often that pin that is unused internally is used to solder a resistor to, which is the suppressor grid pin. So unless, again, the amplifier has been designed specifically to join pins 1 and 8, then don't do it that way.
Okay, so piece of advice is, hypothetically, EL34 and 606s can be interchanged, but make sure the amp you're doing it on has been designed to enable either to go on.
Yeah.
And presumably, actually we should, health and safety warning here, I suspect that the government guidelines for this would be don't attempt to do any of this stuff yourself, always take it to a qualified engineer.
I'd recommend that.
I suppose the sort of common sense approach would just be, if you are going to do this, make sure the amp isn't attached to the mains at the time and give it plenty of time to discharge anything.
And don't refer them to the link of this YouTube channel either.
So what stuff that you can't, so EL84 is a different...
That's different again, yeah.
Pin, so that valve just simply won't fit in the valve
There
base.
are certain people who have made devices which can connect an EL84 to the base of an EL34. So you can supposedly produce that sound, but yeah, on its own they're not interchangeable.
Yeah. And the KT88?
KT88 is very similar to EL34, but they are much fatter.
It's a bigger valve, isn't it? So you might find the physical space.
Yeah, normally we have 2-inch spacing. I don't know why I'm looking at these and not in them, but normally we have 2-inch spacing for. That's 50 millimeters approximately in new money between valves. But on an EL34, but on a KT88, it's normally 25% more than that because they are fat. And if you try and squeeze them in, you might find just a bunch of glass in the back of your amp after a journey, which isn't very cheap to sort out either. Okay, well, as I said, please don't take this video as the official kind of health and safety electrician advice of this. We are simply, I don't even know what we're doing. Basically what I'm trying to say is don't sue us if you kill yourself. Should we mention biasing? Just briefly? We should mention, although we are going to go and do sort of biasing in part 4, but absolutely I think we should certainly say that, it's almost certainly going to be necessary to adjust to rebias on when you change the power valves. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Any other do's and don'ts when it comes to valves? Well, there is some silly things about touching them with skin oil and that kind of thing. That's in our quick fire. Yeah. There probably is a lot of other do's and don'ts, but we've covered the main points. Good. All right. Well, look, thank you very much, Paul. I'm learning stuff. I hope you're learning stuff. This was part 3 of our kind of valve questions answered or something. Part 4 is going to be literally just a quick fire round of questions to Paul, and I think Ian's coming back in as well. But for now, thanks for watching. Please subscribe to Andertons TV, and we shall see you next time.